Hey, I'm David Adelsheim. The story of Adelsheim Vineyard began in 1971. That was the year that Ginny and I decided to risk our life savings on a piece of property in Oregon's North Willamette Valley. Looking back now, we were one of just 10 families that made wine before 1980 from grapes planted on our properties in that region. To celebrate the 50th anniversary of what became our first vineyard, we wanted to tell our story. But we quickly realized that the only way to truly tell our story was to tell the stories of that entire first generation. Our winery team proposed an idea, a series of video conversations with the founders of those first 10 wineries and me. I loved it and set to work contacting my old friends. In each interview, we wanted to go beyond their widely known histories to discover who these people really were and what led them to build our uniquely collaborative, and at least from today's perspective, incredibly successful wine industry. This is our shared story. In April 1971, a mutual friend introduced Ginny and me to Bill Blosser, who is a professor of planning at Portland State University. We met with him in his office and learned that he and his wife Susan had recently purchased property for a vineyard in the Dundee Hills. They invited us to their rented home at the foot of those hills for a memorable May Day party, where we were introduced to the fledgling wine community. David and Diana Lett of the Eyrie Vineyards were there too. We interviewed Susan and Bill one after another in the Legacy Lounge of their new tasting room at their original vineyard site on October 7th, 2020. I'm so happy to be in this room with all the pictures of your various hairstyles, but more important, the pictures of your journey. And I really, as we're doing in these interviews, I really want to focus on the very beginning of this. And in fact, the time before we met you, before you bought the first piece of property, your family was pretty critical to the success of this winery, financially, but perhaps emotionally and with some of the passion coming from them. What was it like growing up in your family in Milwaukee? Was there wine in the family?
There was wine in the family, and I wish I had access to the bottles that my father had in his cellar. He had his own company, he was in the leather business, and he went to France every year for La Semaine de Cuir, the leather week. And over the years, he became quite an enophile and came back, and this was a time when most of his compatriots drank liquor.
Yes.
And so it was pretty unusual. I mean, there was wine around, and he found a wine merchant who imported things for him, and he had a cellar of fantastic Bordeaux and Burgundy and German Mosels, and so I grew up drinking these first growths and Premier Cru that he had. That was my taste. I didn't know anything more about it, but he educated my palate, let's put it that way.
And were there formal lessons around wine bottles or casual mentions at the dinner table?
Well, when he came home from work, he would always have a glass of wine and then wine with dinner, and he would go down to his little wine cellar, and I could go with him, and he would tell me why he was choosing this wine and a little bit about it. So, you know, I had no idea, except that I was absorbing this without my realizing it. So when we started to a vineyard, I had a taste for wine. I had no idea how it was produced. I didn't pay that much attention to labels, except that now when I hear them, I remember what my father loved. And I wish I could be drinking those wines now.
Yeah, no kidding. Wow. Moving ahead to Stanford, where you and Bill both went to school, did you meet while at Stanford?
Yes, we met in a class, Jeffersonian and Jacksonian periods. And Bill had just come back from a year in France and was looking very French, and that drew me to him immediately. So we eyed each other over the course of the class, and by the end of it, we were getting together.
And was wine the first thing out of your mouth? Bill?
No. In fact, when Bill suggested the idea of having a vineyard, I thought he was nuts. I mean, where did that come from? And he can tell you more about that. And actually, I went along because I wanted to support him. I didn't have any better ideas, and it would be an adventure. I didn't really, that swirled around me for the first 10 years, even though I was working in it. I was also had 3 children from 1970 to 1979. And even though I did things and ran the tasting room, et cetera, it wasn't really until I started managing the vineyard that it took. And I became really passionate about our place on the earth, so to speak. And then we sort of crossed because Bill was experiencing burnout and my passion was on the rise and his was on the decline. And that's essentially why I became president.
Yeah. Let's go back to that period from graduation from Stanford until 1970. There were a couple of years in there. Where were those spent? And were they with Bill the whole time?
Oh, yes. So when we graduated, we actually were not planning to get married right away, but ended up getting married right away. Bill was going to go to graduate school and decided not to, so we decided to get married. And I was, right after college, I went to Reed for their Master of Arts in Teaching. By that time, Bill had applied for the graduate program at the University of North Carolina Planning Department, Planning School, to get his Master's of City and Regional Planning. We went to North Carolina for 2 years, where I worked in the private manuscripts collection in the basement of the library called the Southern Historical Collection. I thought I was in heaven because Southern history had been my field in college.
Oh, wow.
And I'd still be there, But anyway, it's interesting how things build on one another because my experience there is what led me to suggest to Linfield that they have the wine archives, because I realized how important early papers can be. So we came back to Oregon because Bill got a job at Portland State teaching planning, and I was pregnant. So that was 1970, I guess. And
still no commitment?
It was on the way back in our Volkswagen camper, driving back to Oregon, that Bill suggested, what do you think about starting a vineyard?
So you arrive in Oregon.
Right, and we started looking. We rented a house and started looking. The big decision was, did we want to be in California or Oregon if we had a vineyard? Bill was from California. He knew it well. He made some trips down there. We finally decided, I mean, it was a decision between buying land in a place that had an established wine industry or a place that had nothing but potential. So, being young and foolish, we chose the place with nothing but potential. I mean, we were two liberal arts graduates. We knew how to do research. We did a lot of research. And we eventually found this beautiful little 18 acres that was a dilapidated prune orchard. The trees had all fallen over in the Columbus Day storm.
What led you, from your perspective, to go from planting grapes to deciding in 77 or before that you wanted to be in the wine business, not just the grape business?
Well, that was a big leap because our goal was to have a vineyard. And that's what interested Bill and interested me, was the agricultural part of it. And I look back and I think, we were part of the Back to the Land movement of the early 1970s. Mm-hmm. A lot of young professionals were going back to the land, and we had enough of the Horatio Alger in us that we started a business instead of a commune.
Right. Right.
But it was really my father who urged us to start a winery and was willing to invest in it when he saw we were serious. After 4 years, he was willing to invest, talked my brothers into investing. It was much faster than we would have done. So he invested in the vineyard, and then a few years later talked my brothers into starting the winery. Really pushed us. But the reality was that the women really was couples who developed the industry. The guys couldn't have done it on their own. A good example of that is when Bill was able to leave CH2M and come into the winery full-time as president, I didn't want to work for him. I didn't want him to be my boss. This was, an equal partnership. So we looked for something that I could do. Well, what was there? There was the vineyard. And so I took over the vineyard. Steep learning curve. I mean, I'd been keeping the books and writing the checks, I knew how to drive the tractor, but I was not managing the vineyard. And I learned how to do that. I learned how to operate all the equipment, how to load the trucks with a forklift on the back of the tractor. The Pinot Noir celebration, that came about because Bill was initially on the founding board of that. And I guess followed that, went to some board meetings, and it became clear to me that this was not going to go anywhere unless it had somebody who was going to take responsibility for making it happen. And so I offered to do it. And it was a paid position. Not very much, but it was a paid position. But the Pinot Noir celebration really was something special. And, there's so many little details for it. It was a celebration because the French didn't want to be included if it was a competition. And so he said, okay, it's going to be a celebration of one wine, Pinot Noir. How fabulous was that? I want to say one more thing about, I suppose, feminism, is that one of the things I'm really grateful for is that Bill always encouraged me. He encouraged me to take over the vineyard. He was willing to let me be president, a position I never would have been hired for based on experience. And when I did start full-time in the vineyard, he said, since you're working full-time now, or close to full-time and taking care of the kids, I think we should share the cooking. So we started, I'd cook dinners one week, and then he'd cook dinners one week. And I have to say, this raised the level of food in our house.
It was a competition?
There was unspoken competition, but that I really appreciated that. I thought that was a really generous gesture.
Well, and to carry on from your point, your daughter and your son are co-presidents today. Their jobs are very distinct. There are other wineries where it isn't necessarily two siblings that are presidents, but maybe a couple. But sometimes it is the woman that is the winemaker. Mm-hmm. And that wouldn't have happened at the time of the founding. Are you resting on your laurels yet?
Well, I don't see them as laurels.
No, I don't think any of us are in that respect. Susan, thank you for opening a bottle of wine and for sharing.
Well,
so many
cheers
thoughts.
to you, David.
To you, Susan. Thanks. Bill, thanks so much for agreeing to be part of this. We're looking to talk to you about the beginning of the wine industry, the thing that is much less accessible to people today, because in the late 60s and early 70s, when we started, it was a different time, obviously, but I wanted to go back even before that, because you've told me that you wanted to grow things. And I was trying to figure out how a kid growing up in Oakland decided he wanted to grow things.
You know, I don't know why. I just know that from the time I was a little kid, I remember on Saturdays, our gardener always came on Saturdays. And I had nothing more that I wanted to do but to go and just sit and watch him do his thing. And I always liked to putter around the garden. I had chickens and
in Oakland?
In Oakland, yeah, we had about an acre of land up in a canyon, and so I had chickens that got eventually eaten by whatever, rats or foxes or something. Then as I grew to be a preteen and a teenager, I finagled ways to work on ranches and farms in the summer for a month or two. And so I don't know, it just was something there that I can't explain, and I don't know where it came from.
Why grapes? I mean,
well, you know, during those times when I had a little landscaping business, and I worked in a nursery during the school year, and then, as I said, in summers I would work on ranches. And I loved the nursery business to an extent, but there was none of those experiences captured me the way it happened to me when I went to France. I was 19. I just took off for a year and went to France. And the first thing that struck me was wine at every meal in restaurants when I was studying in Paris. And then my hitchhiking on weekends out to vineyards and stuff, and I just saw all that and I just said, wow.
did your family drink wine when you were growing up?
No, they collected wine. And I say that facetiously because my father, as a physician, would often get gifts from his patients at the end of the year, and often it would be a gift box of wine or a bottle of wine and a couple of glasses. And he did, the only thing that he knew what you were supposed to do with wine is it needed to be aged in the basement. So when we cleaned out his house some 25 years ago, 30 years later, there were all these gift boxes of completely rotten Paul Masson Vin Rosé and things like that, things that needed to have been drunk within months. There wasn't a bottle that was worth drinking. And so that was the extent of wine in my family. My father was a old-fashioned drinker, and that was it. I came back from France in 1964, and that is the precise time that the whole U.S. wine industry started coming back alive. There were articles coming out in magazines all over the country about wine is coming back in the United States after having died in Prohibition. And so I was reading that and just lapping it up. And one particular article was in Esquire and had interviews with a lot of the new people that were starting out. Joe Heitz was one, Robert Mondavi, of course, and then a guy, Tony Hoosh, who was up in Philo. And when Susan and I got back to Oregon, the first thing I did was write him, because he was an urban planner by background. So I thought, hey, I had to go talk to this guy for that reason. And the second reason was that he was up in the area where you could grow Pinot Noir. And
Anderson Valley.
I came back from France with the idea in my mind, Pinot Noir was what I
wait. So we've skipped over something here. How did that happen?
Just because the wines that I ended up enjoying the most were Pinots.
But by the time you left France, you knew what Pinot Noir was, and you thought of that as a grape that was important to you.
And at least the beginning of that thought, the other big thing that really sealed the deal was when Susan and I got married in '66, and I got introduced to her father's cellar. That was a real awakening, because he was one of the original wine nuts in the United States with a wonderful cellar, and he had, as Susan said, a great Burgundy collection. And so I had an opportunity to taste way better than the carafe wines that I was used to in France, and that had a big impact on me too. And then we had the experience in the Realtor where we met Gary Fuqua and then met Dickie Rath, and that completely sealed the deal. I mean, it was, as Susan said, it was way less expensive here. It was an adventure. We didn't have hardly any money, so and
you
also,
could keep working.
I kept working.
Yeah,
and we felt immediate camaraderie with this bunch of crazy people who were going to try and grow grapes in Oregon. It just felt right. But we started out really driven by Gus Sokol's vision and his money. He was what enabled us to finance buying land and starting a winery. And he was also a big thinker and felt that we shouldn't start with a little winery in the back of a garage. We had to start with a real operation. So we built a pretty significant winery building. He also pushed us to hire somebody that would look at the big picture of how you could be profitable, we had hoped, as a winery. And that was hiring Bruce Johnson, then was Sterling as a marketing guru to help us figure out.
Was it marketing in the pure sense, or did that include sales? Or
sales, logos, the whole thing about. He created the first spreadsheet for 5-year projection of sales, and he's the one who drove us to. He said, "You have to have a tasting room." So we built the first tasting room as a tasting room in Oregon.
The story obviously needs to go to Yamhill County and the 1974 process that you were involved in, and I think were in many ways the co-spiritual leader of designating all the hillsides in Yamhill County for ag use.
When Senate Bill 100 passed,
right,
and made a requirement, that the counties really redo their comprehensive plans entirely, and designate prime agricultural land. And they could only designate a certain amount of urban land.
And they had to have a boundary around it.
They had to have an urban growth boundary around cities, but rural residential land was not part of the deal in Senate Bill 100. It either was going to be urban land around towns and cities, or it was going to be ag land. And so they had
Forestry.
to figure out, okay, what are we going to do with all this land that we've heretofore zoned as rural residential 5-acre, 10-acre plots in the hills. And so I was working in urban planning at that time, and it was an obvious thing for me to jump into on behalf of the industry. I just remember going into the county and saying, okay, well, you guys, what are you going to do? And they said, we don't know, and nobody knew really.
Right.
And so I kind of went home and started thinking about how we could create a model or an overlay for defining good grape land. We started listing the criteria for prime grape land, elevation, soils, slope, exposure,
Right.
being the prime ones. And then it was fairly straightforward to draw those lines.
Draw the circles around these places,
On areas in Yamhill County. And then the Thousand Friends of Oregon, which was a land use advocacy group at that time, I remember them pushing to, well, let's expand this to the whole valley. Let's not just make this Yamhill County. We're concerned about areas much broader than just Yamhill County. So we expanded it to Washington County and Polk and Benton and on down the valley. And so that little bit of work that we did here in Yamhill County became the model for the whole Willamette Valley.
What happened to the kid that wanted to grow things?
He lived his dream. And has till I'm 76, and so it's been going on now for 50 years.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.